Now in Washington, the brother of George Floyd has addressed the US Congress. Philonise Floyd spoke to the House Judiciary Committee as it considers the issue of police brutality. He said his brother could not become another name on a list of African Americans who've lost their lives at the hands of US police.
I couldn't take care of George that day he was killed, but maybe by speaking with you today, I can make sure that his death will not be in vain. I'm tired. I'm tired of pain. Pain you feel when you watch something like that. When you watch your big brother, who you looked up to for your whole life, die begging for his mom. I'm here to ask you to make it stop. Stop the pain. Stop us from being tired. George called for help and he was ignored. Please listen to the call I'm making to you now.
Well, before Mr. Floyd spoke, the hearing was opened by the House Judiciary Committee, the Democrat Jerry Nadler. He recounted the events in Minneapolis and said the American people wanted meaningful change.
We are all familiar with the terrifying words, "I can't breathe." They were uttered in Minneapolis by George Floyd while a police officer pinned a knee to his neck for a chilling 8 minutes and 46 seconds, taking from him the final breath of life. 6 years ago, Eric Garner uttered those exact same fateful words while locked in a chokehold in New York City. He too died at the hands of law enforcement. Millions of Americans now call out "I can't breathe" as a rallying cry in streets all across our country, demanding a fundamental change in the culture of law enforcement and meaningful accountability for officers who commit misconduct. Today, we answer their call.
Well, on the Republican side, we heard from Jim Jordan. He's a senior Republican in that same House Judiciary Committee, and he paid his respects to George Floyd's brother. He recognised the importance for change as well. He did also have criticism for some of the protesters.
The American people understand it's time for a real discussion, real debate, real solutions about police treatment of African Americans. Americans also understand that peaceful protest, exercising their First Amendment liberties, honors George Floyd's memory, and it helps that discussion, that debate, and those solutions actually happen. And guess what Americans also get? Guess what else they understand? They know it is pure insanity to defund the police. And the fact that my Democrat colleagues won't speak out against this crazy policy is just that frightening.
Well, the push for police reform, as you can hear, is gaining momentum, but police unions say their officers need to be part of that conversation. That was a point that was forcefully made on Tuesday by the president of New York's Association of Police Unions.
I am not Derek Chauvin. They are not him. He killed someone. We didn't. We are restrained. Stop treating us like animals and thugs, and start treating us with some respect. That's what we're here today to say. We've been left out of the conversation. We've been vilified. It's disgusting. It's disgusting.
Let's bring in the BBC's Catty Kay in Washington. Catty, I was interested watching that clip. Do you think the police unions are being left out of the conversation? Because I had an impression they had very good contacts with the main political players.
Look, the police unions have been actually seen as a major block to police reform in this country because they have a huge amount of power. They are the people who can stop older police officers from being fired. They can protect police officers who have been accused of violence against minority communities, and they are sort of seen as this stumbling block. So I think those who are calling for radical reform of the American policing system and an end to police brutality, particularly against African Americans, would like to bypass the unions, or would like to find a way to get the police unions not to have so much power in this country. And I think that this whole issue of kind of defunding police is caught up with the role of police unions, who have been a kind of hindrance to having some kind of reform.
And what about that committee? We've just been hearing a clip of George Floyd's brother speaking at it. The Democrats and the Republicans don't have a great track record in recent times of finding a way to work together. Is there any evidence they can do it this time around?
It's been really interesting listening to Republicans over the last few days. I mean, I think all politicians in this country have been caught by surprise, really, at the power of these protests and at the scale of these protests. And Republicans in particular feel that they have been rather wrong-footed by all of this, or been on the wrong side of all of this, and are now kind of playing catch-up. So actually, one of the things I thought was interesting in the judiciary hearings was to hear Republicans say, we also do believe there has to be reform. We see that there is a problem here that needs to be addressed. Now, the way they want to address it is different from the Democrats. The Democrats' proposals are more radical, but it has forced Republicans into the position of having to come up with counter-proposals. And even in the White House, we're expecting now to hear from Donald Trump with some kind of proposal in the next day or two on police reforms. They don't want to feel that they are being left behind in this conversation. But you're right, neither Democrats nor Republicans historically clearly have, because we have seen so many times when African Americans have been attacked violently so by police, have managed to fix the fundamental problem that's driving these protests.
Stay with me, Katy. Let's continue to explore this political dimension of the story. Of course, there's an election in November, and on this issue of racial injustice, attitudes among Americans seem to be shifting fast. Have a look at this from the New York Times. In the last 2 weeks, support for the Black Lives Matter movement has increased almost as much as it did in the last 2 years. And it's been Donald Trump's challenger, Joe Biden, who's been more willing to align himself with Black Lives Matter. For example, he made this video contribution to George Floyd's funeral on Tuesday.
We can heal this nation's wounds and remember its pain, not callous the heart and forget. Well, today, now is the time, the purpose, the season to listen and heal. Now is the time for racial justice. That's the answer we must give to our children when they ask why. Because when there is justice for George Floyd, we will truly be on our way to racial justice in America.
Well, Joe Biden's followed up this Wednesday with an opinion piece for USA Today. In it, he writes, "We know the nation we want to be. Now we have to deliver on this moment to achieve fundamental changes that address racial inequalities and white supremacy in our country." And on the issue of defunding the police, Mr. Biden's not keen. He writes, "The better answer is to give police departments the resources they need to implement meaningful reforms and to condition other federal dollars on completing those reforms." He's also promising an extra $300 million to improve community policing if he becomes president. And not everyone's impressed with that plan. The American comedian Rob Delaney put it this way: "You defund the police. Joe Biden, I hear you, I see you. Let's give them an additional $300 million. Or this is Crystal Ball from The Hill's programme Rising. "Joe Biden's op-ed," she says, "is a perfect example of why many police reform efforts have failed, because they usually just end up providing increased funding for further expansion of the police states." But amongst Democrats, there's optimism that Joe Biden can bring some form of change. Here's Jamira Burley, who was Deputy Millennial Vote Director for Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Many times the average voter in America feels like the Democratic Party do not engage them unless it's an election year. And I think this is the time, very similar to 2016, where we can't take any vote for granted. I think what we saw over the last few months, especially during Super Tuesday, there was a lot of prominent African-American leaders, a lot of elders who came out in support of Joe Biden. And I think where we see a lot of younger Black voters who are more for a revolutionary change, who want to break down systemic systems of oppression and dismantle the police, I think they're a little hesitant of Joe Biden. But what I think is very different than 2016 is that now people see the stark contrast between Biden and Trump.
Well, President Trump and the Republicans are also under pressure to develop their own plans for police reform. Katy was alluding to them a little bit earlier. Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican senator, is leading the development of a Justice Act. This is the draft. It focuses on issues of reporting, accountability, training and community relations, but it's much less sweeping than the Democrats' Justice in Policing Act, which they announced on Monday. And with the pressure to present an alternative move palatable to Republicans, Senator Scott has already met with Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, on Tuesday evening to discuss the policy plans. Katy, if I could bring you back in at this point, both parties with different ambitions. I suppose the question lingering behind all of this is, what's different this time? It's not like we haven't known about racial injustice before.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I keep asking people who are going to these protests and African-American leaders. And one of the things they point to is the widespread involvement in these protests of white people. And they say that is something they haven't seen before. The other thing they point to is the global nature of the protests, the fact that other countries are now addressing these racial issues. So that there's a sense of urgency that is there, and some sense of optimism amongst some African Americans, particularly in the civil rights movement, who feel that this moment is different, that the video was so startling. Some have even suggested that the fact that the country had been in lockdown because of the coronavirus for a couple of months, that there are no sporting games, for example, on television, has really focused people on this issue, that there are no other distractions from it. And they hope that now they have the attention of Americans at large, and particularly of white Americans, that can affect change in a way perhaps that the killing in Ferguson didn't back in 2015. And so they think that this could be a different moment.
The death of George Floyd and the protests that have followed have impacted countries in a range of ways, from politics to policing and culture too. For example, this is the poster for the film Gone with the Wind. It came out in 1939. It's still the highest grossing film of all time, and it won 10 Oscars. One of those was the first one won by a black actress, Hattie McDaniel. But today HBO Max has removed it from its streaming service, saying it would return it at a later date, accompanied with a discussion of its historical context. And this controversy is not new. The film's long been criticised for its depiction of slavery. If you've not seen it, the story's set during and after the American Civil War, and in the film, people who are slaves seem contented with their situation. In another development in the UK, Ant and Dec, two very well-known TV presenters for those of you outside the UK, well, they've apologised for a segment on their TV show in which they impersonated people of colour using blackface. They tweeted a statement which says, "We realise that this was wrong and want to say that we are sincerely sorry to everyone we offended. We purposely stopped doing this several years ago and would certainly not make these sketches today." And in the US, the cable network Paramount has cancelled Cops. It's one of America's longest running reality shows. It was first aired more than 3 decades ago. On all of these issues, let's hear the analysis of the BBC's media editor, Amal Rajan.
The issue at stake here isn't just about one film or one statue. It's a much broader thing about whether you apply modern standards to history, even while recognising that those modern standards, modern morality is contested, it's fluid, and will one day itself belong to history, the scrap heap of history, as we said in that report. And whether it's statues of long dead men, and it does always seem to be men, or whether it's films like Gone with the Wind or programmes like Little Britain, there does seem to be a sort of a global movement emerging which is saying that we should reappraise our heritage. But of course, it's fraught with difficulty, because the obvious question is, where does this end? I've just got the collected works of Tintin, which I'm reading with my son, and my mixed heritage son, and an exhibition of racial tolerance it certainly is not. So the question is whether or not you extend this and apply it to lots and lots of different aspects of our culture. But this is, I think, the beginning of a culture war powered by digital media, which makes me think that another novelist, William Faulkner, had it about right when he said that the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past.
Well, here's another example of change. The American dictionary Merriam-Webster says it will update its definition of the word racism. That's after this woman, Kennedy Mitchum, wrote to them to suggest it should include reference to systemic oppression. She said people kept copying and pasting the current definition to her in an attempt to prove racism could only exist if you believe your race to be superior to another. Merriam-Webster wrote back and agreed to update it, saying that revision would be carried from August. Also being intensely debated are, as you'll know, statues and a number of public memorials. You'll have seen the video from Sunday of a statue of a Bristol slave trader being brought down by protesters and then thrown into Bristol's harbour. Well, today the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, tweeted this. He says, "We've unveiled a new commission to review and improve the diversity of our public landmarks. We must commemorate the achievements and diversity of all in our city, and that includes questioning which legacies are being celebrated." Well, some decisions have already been made already. This is from last night. A statue of a man called Robert Milligan was officially removed. Milligan founded the West India Docks in London, which were at this location. He was also a slave trader. He owned 2 sugar plantations and 526 slaves in Jamaica. The Museum for London, opposite which the statue stood, was in favour of its removal. It tweeted, "The Museum of London recognises that the monument is part of the ongoing problematic regime of whitewashing history, which disregards the pain of those who are still wrestling with the remnants of the crimes Milligan committed against humanity." And all across the UK, similar debates are taking place, not just in the UK, but particularly here, given the UK's history of empire and its role in the slave trade. And lots of people are getting involved. Activists have set up this website with a hit list of statues, plaques and memorials across the country, which they believe should be taken down. They've called it Topple the Racists. Some have already gone. This pub sign of a black man's head in Derbyshire was on the target list. The council says they will remove it, but residents took it down before the council could act, vowing to return it. And what Amar was saying about media applies to these public landmarks as well. While some cases are clearer cut than others, there's no consensus over where to draw the line or how to judge people whose public record included both bad and good. The site I showed you includes petitions to bring down statues of past prime ministers like Robert Peel and William Gladstone because they were against the abolition of the slave trade. John Kay has been looking into this issue from the south of England through another powerful historical figure.
He is Tavistock's most famous son. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the world. But is global change now catching up with him? Last night, protesters defaced the monument in his hometown. Is it time for that statue to go?
I think it probably is.
Tony says there should now be a public vote, but he knows it'll be controversial in a town that relies on the man who famously defeated the Spanish Armada.
So we're just about to come out of a coronavirus crisis, which has hit a lot of businesses very badly. And I don't want to see the demise of tourism, but I think, like any history, has not just to honour people's names, to remember, but remember good deeds and foul.
We did the whole commemorative pageant on Sir Francis Drake and what.
Jessica grew up in Tavistock and studied Drake at school. She'd like her kids to learn more about his links to slavery, but she thinks his statue should stay.
You can't erase it, it's always going to be there, so maybe just educate people a little bit more on what he stood for. But as for taking him down, absolutely ludicrous.
One last thing to show you on this. Adidas has pledged to hire more black and Latino employees in the US after criticism over a lack of diversity at the firm. Let's hear from Samira Hussain in New York on this.
One of the criticisms has always been that, yes, these companies can make statements, but they're not actually having any diversity represented on their boards or within any of their leadership or even within the people that work at the company. So what Adidas has said is that it is committed to hiring 30% of its staff to be represented by the Black and Latin communities. And that is a step in the right direction.